Today, we are going to discuss about compassion, karuna, in Theravada Buddhism. Lord Gautama Buddha has described 4 positive qualities or virtues that are inherent in the human mind. And they are called divine abodes or Brahma Viharas. And they are loving kindness, metta, compassion, karuna, sympathetic joy, mudita, and equanimity, upekha. Now, if one cultivates these 4 qualities further, that can lead to one's positive emotional health, happiness, and rewarding social relationships. And it can also contribute to one's spiritual development. Now, Brahmas are celestial beings who exist in the celestial worlds called the Brahma worlds. And it is said that these Brahmas possess these 4 qualities in abundance. Now, here Brahma means superior or divine qualities, and Vihara means dwelling places. So, Brahma Vihara means superior divine qualities as dwelling places. Now, these 4 qualities are inherently present in the human mind, but they function at different levels depending on how they are cultivated and practiced. And the 4 qualities are also known as limitless and immeasurable qualities. Now, the 4 Brahma Viharas existed in India even before Lord Gautama Buddha appeared. But people during that time were practicing the 4 Brahma Viharas in meditation in order to develop deep mental absorptions called jhanas, expecting to gain a rebirth in one of those Brahma worlds. The Buddha adapted and reinterpreted the same 4 Brahma Viharas so that one could practice them in such a way that it can contribute to one's path of liberation from suffering. Now, compassion is the quality of the mind that can feel empathy and concern for distress and suffering in other people, as if it's one's own, and then to develop a desire to do something to reduce or end that distress and suffering. Now, karuna is a word in the Pali language, and that means the aspiration to find a way to be truly helpful to oneself and others. Now, compassion consists of 2 Latin words. Com means with, and passio means suffering. So, compassion is an innate, inherent quality in the human mind, but that needs to be developed and cultivated. Because it is possible that the quality of compassion can be suppressed and inhibited by negative mental defilements such as resentment, envy, and jealousy. Now, in the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the Buddhist path of liberation from suffering, the Buddha described three types of right intentions that need to be developed by any disciple who is cultivating the Buddhist path of liberation. And the three right intentions are right intention of renunciation, right intention of goodwill, and right intention of harmlessness. Now, one develops right intention of harmlessness in order to counter the negative and harmful thoughts of aggression, violence, and cruelty towards others. And when one practices loving kindness, that will naturally lead to compassion. Whenever one sees distress and suffering in others, with a desire to help those suffering people to be relieved from that distress and suffering. Now, the cultivation of compassion is based on the belief that similar to ourselves, all other beings in the universe also like to enjoy happiness and wish to be free from any suffering. Now, true compassion is one's ability to wish relief from distress and suffering in others, irrespective of who they are, whether they are good or bad, friendly or unfriendly. If one has some understanding of one's own distress and suffering and a feeling of compassion towards oneself, that can enhance one's ability to practice compassion towards other people. Now, there are some people who can show compassion to non-people, such as their family, friends, relatives, or others who are known to them, but not to other people. And there are others who find it difficult to show compassion if other people are in distress and suffering due to their own behavior, and also to people who have been hostile to them or who are their enemies. Now, there is a set of 5 precepts of morality that lay Buddhist disciples are expected to observe, and that is to abstain from killing any living beings, to abstain from stealing, to abstain from sexual misconduct, to abstain from false speech, and to abstain from any drugs and intoxicants. Now, the first precept of abstention from killing any living beings is based on compassion to other living beings. Now, one does not want to be harmed or killed. And similarly, other living beings also don't want to be harmed or killed. And Buddha has said, if one reflects on this line of thinking, it will help to abstain from killing any living beings. And that fact was well said by the Buddha in a book called Dhammapada. Now, Dhammapada is one of the 15 books of Khuddaka Nikaya, that is the collection of Buddha's minor discourses. And there are 423 verses said by the Buddha recorded in the Dhammapada. And the verse 129 says, Sabbe tasanti dandasa sabbe bhayanti machuno attanam upamam katva na haneya na gataye. All fear the stick, all fear death. Comparing oneself with others, one should neither hurt nor cause to hurt. Now, when one reads about Lord Gautama Buddha in the Buddhist scriptures, it is clear that the Buddha was showing great compassion to all other living beings. Now, in a previous birth, the Buddha was an ascetic called Sumedha. And during that birth, he had enough potential to practice the Buddhist path of liberation and gain enlightenment as an arahant. But instead of that, through great compassion for the human beings, he took the vow to become a Samma Sambuddha in a future birth. And he went through immense suffering over an incalculable period of time to perfect 10 perfections in order to become a Samma Sambuddha. And in this life, also, having been born into a royal family, he gave up all the royal comforts to become a homeless ascetic in order to find a way out of human suffering. And as a Buddhist aspirant or bodhisattva in this life, he underwent 6 years of suffering and self-mortification, looking for a path out of human suffering. And when he finally became a Samma Sambuddha, through great compassion, he taught the Buddhist doctrine and the path of liberation from suffering to others for 45 years until he passed away. It is said that every morning the Buddha used to survey the world through his divine eye to see who could be spiritually helped on that day. And if he discovered that so and so could be helped on that day, the Buddha would go to them, often on foot, uninvited, and teach the doctrine. And having listened to the Buddha's teaching, they would very often practice the Buddhist path of liberation and attain various stages of enlightenment. So during the 45 years of the Buddha's ministry, the Buddha helped the poor, the bereaved, the sick, kings, rulers, criminals, those of high and low caste, followers of other religions, with no discrimination at all. And it is recorded in one of the Buddha's discourses that even while on his deathbed, the Buddha volunteered to teach the doctrine to a man who listened to the Buddha, realized the truth, and gained enlightenment. Now, compassion is one's genuine wish, which is not selfish or self-centered. A wish to see happiness in others and to do whatever one can to relieve distress and suffering in other people. If one has the quality of compassion in their mind, it could manifest as one's ability to share and to show sympathy to others, and one's ability to empathize with others who are in distress or suffering, and also the ability to care and concern for others. Now, the compassion is not self-pity or pity for others who are experiencing any misfortune, distress, or suffering. Now, when one practices compassion, one should be able to place oneself in the shoes of the other person who is in distress and suffering. And one should also be able to see life from the point of view of another. If someone or someone's family have gone through a similar experience of distress and suffering, it will be easier for them to empathize with others who are in similar situations, because then one will know how it feels like and the consequences of that distress and suffering. Now, when one practices compassion, if one expects to gain any benefit, such as good reputation, praise, or improved relationships, there is a selfish motive there. So it is not true compassion. In a discourse called Agatha Vinaya Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the collection of the Buddha's numerical discourses, Buddha stated 5 techniques that one can practice if one has developed any anger, aversion, or hatred towards other person. And one of the techniques was to show compassion towards that person. Buddha said, when one gives birth to hatred for an individual, one should develop compassion for that individual. Thus, the hatred towards that person should be subdued. In another discourse called Maharahulovada Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, that's a collection of the Buddha's middle-length discourses, the Buddha was instructing Venerable Rahula, who happened to be Buddha's son during lay life. And the Buddha instructed Venerable Rahula to meditate on compassion so that he can get rid of the negative quality of cruelty. Buddha said, develop the meditation of compassion. For when you are developing the meditation of compassion, cruelty will be abandoned. Now, one should have compassion towards oneself as well. Because if one does not have compassion for oneself, it is possible that when one is in distress or suffering, one could be quite harsh to oneself, believing that one deserves to suffer. And one's inability to understand distress and suffering in other people can often lead to selfishness, insensitivity, lack of care and concern for the welfare of other people. And it can also lead to ignore or even downplay others' suffering and to various discriminative practices. Now let us briefly look at meditation on compassion, karuna bhavana. Now in the Buddhist literature, there are 40 meditation objects that are suitable for concentration meditation, samatha bhavana. And compassion is one of those 40 meditation objects. And here the aim is to develop tranquility and concentration of the mind. Now, when one pays full attention on compassion as the object of meditation, concentration of the mind develops. And as the concentration develops, negative mental defilements called mental hindrances get gradually suppressed. And the 5 mental hindrances that the Buddha has described are sensual desire, kama chanda, ill will, vyapada, sloth and torpor, tina middha, restlessness and remorse, uddacha kukkucha, and skeptical doubt, vichikiccha. And as the 5 mental hindrances get suppressed, 5 positive qualities called jhana factors develop. And with the development of the jhana factors, as the concentration deepens, deep mental absorptions called jhanas develop. And the Buddha has described 8 jhanas that one can develop through concentration meditation. Now, when one practices meditation on compassion, one is able to attain the first 3 jhanas of the 8. Now, this concentrated mind one can use to practice insight meditation, vipassana bhavana, to gain an insight and wisdom into the 3 universal characteristics of every phenomenon in this world. And that is, everything is impermanent, anicca, leads to suffering, dukkha, and has no permanent entity called self, anatta. And when one realizes the 3 characteristics through insight meditation, one is able to gain enlightenment. Now, compassion meditation can be practiced anywhere. But initially, it is helpful to sit in a quiet place to practice compassion. And it can also be practiced in any of the 4 postures: sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. Now, in order to practice compassion, one should first have a positive mindset. So it is useful to practice loving kindness meditation first before practicing compassion meditation. And in practicing compassion, it is helpful first to think of a person who is actually in distress or suffering at the present time. Because when you can think of someone who is actually in distress and is suffering, it is easier to arouse feeling of compassion and the desire to help that person. In practicing compassion, one does not need to know the person in distress. But if one knows the person, it is easier to develop compassion. But one could express compassion to anyone, known or unknown, or living anywhere. It is advised that when one initially practice compassion meditation, not to select someone who is in severe distress or suffering, because the intensity of distress and suffering can overwhelm the meditator emotionally, causing anxiety and fear. So when one practices compassion meditation, thinking of someone in distress, one can visualize that person in the mind and first send loving kindness to that person. And then the meditator can contemplate on that person's suffering and wish the person's distress and suffering to stop and be happy. It can be helpful to repeat certain phrases mentally when one practices compassion meditation. One could say, "May you be free of pain and sorrow. May you be well and happy." And when one develops compassion for that particular person in distress, then one could continue to express compassion towards others in any order that one can choose. Now, one order to express compassion to others is to select a person dear to one next, and then a neutral person, a hostile person, and then all living beings in the universe. And again, mentally repeating, "May all beings be free of pain and sorrow. May all beings be well and happy." Now, one should be able to express compassion to all living beings in the universe in a boundless and limitless manner. And there are two techniques that one could use in order to express compassion to all living beings. Now, in the first technique, one can extend compassion to all living beings who are living in the 10 geographical directions. That is, all living beings living in the north, south, east, west, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, above and below. And in the second technique, one can extend compassion to all living beings in an expanding order of geographical locations. One can begin extending compassion to all beings living in one's residence, and then gradually extend it to all living beings in one's neighborhood, village, town, county, state or province, country, continent, whole world, and the universe. Now, some meditation teachers suggest that similar to practicing loving kindness meditation, one should start sending feelings of compassion to oneself first. And that one can do by mentally repeating, "May I be free of pain and sorrow. May I be well and happy." Now, when one practices compassion meditation, one needs to keep an eye on two types of enemies which can disrupt the meditation process. There is a far enemy and a near enemy. The far enemy to compassion is cruelty, and that is wanting to cause harm, physical and mental harm or pain and unhappiness in others. And cruelty is easy enough to identify. But the near enemy is more difficult to identify. And that is sentimental pity. Because when sentimental pity appears, one can mistake it as true compassion. And superficially, sentimental pity can look exactly like true compassion. But the difference is, when one has sentimental pity, one cannot identify with the sufferer. One may feel that one is superior and more fortunate than the sufferer not to be in such a distress or suffering. And it can also create a strong sense of sadness and sympathy instead of being able to empathize with the person who is in distress. Thank you very much.